It was a Thursday evening when my world came crashing down. The faint glow of my wife's phone screen illuminated the darkened room as I walked in from work. I had been looking forward to a quiet evening, perhaps sharing a glass of wine while discussing our day. Instead, I found myself standing frozen in the doorway, my heart pounding in my chest as I caught a glimpse of the messages displayed on her phone. "Can't wait to see you tonight, read one. Your place or mine?" Followed another. The sender's name was all too familiar, Mark. My closest friend, the man I had trusted with my life, my secrets, and now, it seemed, my wife. I felt a surge of disbelief wash over me, quickly followed by a tidal wave of anger. I had always known that Mark was charming, perhaps too charming, but I had never imagined he would cross this line. I confronted her right then and there. The confrontation was a storm of accusations and desperate pleas. "It's not what it looks like," she cried, but the look on her face told me everything I needed to know. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife. My wife, the woman I had loved for years, had chosen to be with my friend. The memories of our life together flashed through my mind like a montage of happier times. I remembered our wedding day, the joy, the laughter, the promises we made to each other. I thought of the quiet evenings spent cooking together, the vacations we took, the dreams we shared. All of it felt like a cruel joke now, a facade that had been shattered in an instant. As the reality of the situation sank in, I felt a mix of emotions swirling inside me: anger, sadness, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I had given her my heart, my trust, and she had thrown it away for a man who had been a brother to me. It was a betrayal that was not only personal but also public in its humiliation. I could feel the heat rising to my face as I processed the gravity of what was happening. The tears streamed down her face, but I felt numb. I didn't want to hear her excuses or her apologies. I wanted to scream, to rage against the injustice of it all. I wanted to make her feel the pain she had inflicted on me. But most of all, I wanted to understand how this had happened. How could she do this to me? How could Mark, of all people, betray me like this? In that moment, my heart hardened. I was no longer just a husband betrayed. I was a man wronged and determined to seek justice. I remembered the way Mark had bragged about his latest real estate deals, how he had built his empire from the ground up. I had always admired his ambition, but now, with the taste of betrayal in my mouth, I felt a burning desire to see him brought low. The thought of revenge began to take root in my mind. It was a dark and twisted seed, but in that moment of raw emotion, it felt like the only way to regain my sense of control. I wanted him to feel the weight of his choices, to lose everything he had worked for, just as he had taken from me. As I stood there, the reality of my life began to shift. I was no longer just a husband, I was a man preparing for war, and I would make sure that Mark lost everything. The days that followed my discovery were a whirlwind of confusion and despair. I found myself replaying the moments leading up to that fateful evening, searching for clues that I had overlooked. Was there something in her demeanor that had changed? Had I been so wrapped up in my own life that I failed to see the signs? The nagging questions haunted me, each one like a dagger twisting deeper into my heart. I remembered the early days of our relationship, the spark that had ignited my love for her. We were young and carefree, lost in the thrill of new love. I could still hear her laughter echoing in my mind, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke of her dreams. We had built a life together, a partnership that I thought was unbreakable. But now, all of that felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the betrayal I had endured. I thought back to the times we spent with Mark. He had always been the life of the party, the one who could charm anyone with a smile or a joke. I had admired his success, often feeling a sense of pride that my friend was doing so well. We had celebrated his achievements together, toasting to his latest property acquisition or his newest investment. Now, those celebrations felt like a mockery, as if I had been toasting to my own demise. I could not shake the feeling of betrayal. It was a weight that pressed down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every smile, every shared joke now felt tainted. I had trusted Mark, had confided in him about my hopes and fears, and now he had become the embodiment of my pain. It was a betrayal that went beyond romance. It was a betrayal of friendship, loyalty, and trust. I found myself in a spiral of thoughts, questioning everything I had believed about love and fidelity. How could someone I trusted so deeply turn against me? How could my wife, the woman I had vowed to cherish, choose him over me? The disillusionment was suffocating, and I felt myself slipping into a dark place. In the quiet moments alone, I would replay the hurtful words exchanged during our confrontation. "You don't understand," she had pleaded. "It just happened." How could she justify it? It wasn't just a mistake, it was a conscious choice. My heart ached with each thought, each memory of the life we had built together. I had given her everything, and in return she had shattered my trust. It was during one of these moments of reflection that I realized I was at a crossroads. I could either wallow in my pain, allowing it to consume me, or I could channel that pain into something more powerful: revenge. The thought of seeing Mark lose everything he had worked for began to take root, growing stronger with each passing day. I imagined the look on his face when he realized the consequences of his actions. I wanted him to feel the same sense of betrayal that I felt. I wanted him to lose his properties, his wealth, and the life he had built. It was a dark desire, but in that moment it felt justified. As I sat alone in our living room, the silence was deafening. I could almost hear the whispers of my own heart urging me to take action. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming my life, my dignity, and my sense of self. I would not be the victim in this story. I would become the author of my own fate. With that resolve, I began to formulate a plan. I would gather information, find weaknesses in Mark's business dealings, and expose them. I would ensure that he felt the repercussions of his choices. The thought of it sent a chill down my spine, but it also ignited a fire within me. I was done being the wronged husband. I was ready to become a force to be reckoned with. As I leaned back in my chair, I could feel the weight of my pain beginning to shift. It was no longer just about the heartache. It was about taking control of my life and ensuring that those who had betrayed me faced the consequences. I was ready to step into the darkness and embrace the power of revenge. The first step in my plan was to gather information. I needed to know everything about Mark's business dealings, his properties, and any skeletons he might be hiding in his closet. I had spent enough time around him to understand the real estate game, but now I needed to delve deeper. I began by reconnecting with old contacts, people I had met through my own career in finance. I reached out to a few acquaintances in the real estate sector, asking casual questions about Mark and his ventures, all while masking my true intentions. I learned that Mark had several properties in various stages of development. Some were profitable, while others were struggling. There were whispers of financial mismanagement and rumors of unethical practices, things I could use to my advantage. The more I uncovered, the more my anger fueled my resolve. It was like a puzzle, and I was determined to put the pieces together to expose him. In the evenings, I would sit at my desk, poring over documents and emails related to Mark's business. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I pieced together the narrative of his empire. There was something exhilarating about the pursuit of revenge, a thrill that temporarily dulled the pain in my heart. I was no longer just a victim. I was a strategist, plotting my next move. I began to create a timeline of his properties, noting which ones were facing financial difficulties and which ones seemed to be thriving. I discovered that one of his most lucrative investments was a luxury apartment complex he had developed on the outskirts of the city. It was a jewel in his portfolio, but I soon learned that it was also marred by complaints from tenants about construction issues and poor management. This was my entry point. I decided to leverage this information. I reached out to a few tenants under the guise of a concerned citizen, asking them about their experiences. It didn't take long for them to share their grievances. I documented everything: photos of the construction flaws, emails detailing their complaints, and even testimonies about Mark's unresponsiveness. I could feel the pieces of my revenge plan falling into place, but I needed more than just tenant complaints. I needed to hit him where it hurt the most: his reputation. I knew that Mark was proud of his image as a successful businessman. He thrived on the respect and admiration of others. If I could tarnish that image, I could dismantle the foundation of his empire. I began to think about how to expose his unethical practices to the public. I spent hours researching local news outlets, looking for journalists who might be interested in a story about corruption in the real estate market. I found a couple of investigative reporters who had covered similar stories in the past. I crafted an anonymous tip, outlining the issues with Mark's properties and hinting at possible legal violations. I wanted to plant the seeds of doubt in the public's mind. As I worked on my plan, I couldn't help but reflect on the moral implications of my actions. Was I becoming the very thing I despised? I had always believed in fairness and justice, yet here I was plotting the downfall of a man who had once been my friend. But as the memories of betrayal flooded my mind, I pushed those thoughts aside. This was about reclaiming my dignity, about making sure that Mark felt the repercussions of his choices. I also knew that I needed to keep my wife in the dark. I didn't want her to know what I was planning. The last thing I needed was for her to interfere or try to guilt me into forgiveness. I had made my decision and I was determined to follow through. This was my path to healing, or at least I hoped it would be. The more I plotted, the more clarity I found in my purpose. I was no longer just a husband scorned, I was a man on a mission. I would dismantle Mark's empire piece by piece, exposing his flaws for the world to see. It would be a slow burn, but I was patient. I would wait for the perfect moment to strike. As the days turned into weeks, I felt a sense of empowerment building within me. I was taking control of my life, and with each small victory, I felt the weight of my pain begin to lift. I was no longer a passive participant in my own story. I was the author, and I was ready to write the next chapter. With my plan in place, I was ready to execute the first phase of my revenge. I had gathered enough evidence about Mark's questionable business practices to make some noise, and I was eager to see the fallout. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this was not just about punishing him. It was also about regaining my own sense of power and dignity. I decided to start with the luxury apartment complex. I had already spoken to several disgruntled tenants who were more than willing to share their grievances. Armed with their testimonials and my documentation of the construction flaws, I set up a meeting with a local journalist known for exposing corruption in the real estate industry. I reached out anonymously, creating an email account that concealed my identity. I wanted to be sure that my involvement remained hidden. When I met the journalist, I presented the evidence in a way that painted a vivid picture of Mark's negligence. I explained how tenants were living in unsafe conditions and how Mark had failed to address their concerns, despite being aware of the issues. The journalist was intrigued, and I could see the gears turning in his mind. He asked for more details, and I provided everything I had, from tenant interviews to photographs of the construction defects. "People need to know what's happening here," he said, his eyes lighting up with the thrill of a potential story. I could feel a rush of satisfaction at the thought of my plan coming to fruition. This was just the beginning, and I was ready to watch the dominoes fall. While the journalist began his investigation, I turned my attention to the next phase of my revenge. I knew that Mark was heavily involved in several other properties, and I needed to dig deeper into his financial dealings. I reached out to my contacts in the finance world, discreetly inquiring about any public records related to Mark's business transactions. I wanted to find any discrepancies, any signs of financial mismanagement that I could exploit. It didn't take long for my efforts to pay off. I uncovered some troubling information about a real estate deal Mark had completed a few years prior. He had acquired a property under dubious circumstances, and there were rumors that he had cut corners to secure the deal. This was my golden ticket. I knew that if I could expose this, it would not only damage his reputation but could also lead to legal troubles. I contacted another journalist, this time under a different alias. I shared the details of the questionable deal, providing them with the evidence I had gathered. I explained how Mark had manipulated the situation to his advantage, all while ignoring the ethical implications. The journalist was enthusiastic and promised to look into it, which only fueled my determination. As my plan unfolded, I found myself becoming more consumed by the idea of revenge. I would lie awake at night, plotting my next move, thinking about how to ensure Mark felt the full weight of his actions. The thrill of it all was intoxicating, but it also came with a sense of moral conflict. I reminded myself that this was not just revenge, it was justice for the betrayal I had endured. I kept a close eye on the news, eagerly awaiting updates on the stories I had set in motion. When the first article about Mark's luxury apartment complex was published, I felt a surge of triumph. The headline read, "Local developer under fire for tenant neglect," and it detailed the complaints I had helped to surface. The article included quotes from tenants who had shared their experiences, painting Mark as a villain in the eyes of the community. The fallout was immediate. Tenants began to organize protests, demanding better living conditions and accountability from Mark. I watched as his reputation began to crumble. The very image he had worked so hard to build was now under siege. I felt a sense of satisfaction, but there was also a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Was this truly what I wanted? To see someone I once considered a friend brought down in such a public way? As the protests gained traction, I decided to strike again. I reached out to the second journalist, providing them with the additional information about Mark's dubious real estate deal. The next article hit the press like a bombshell, exposing Mark's unethical practices and the questionable circumstances surrounding his property acquisition. The fallout was swift, and I could see the panic in Mark's eyes when I encountered him at a mutual gathering. "Hey man, have you seen the news?" I asked, feigning ignorance, my heart racing at the thought of his reaction. He looked pale, his usual confidence replaced by a sense of dread. "Yeah, it's crazy," he stammered, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. I could hardly contain my satisfaction as I watched him squirm. The consequences were unfolding just as I had planned. Mark's business began to suffer. Investors pulled out, and his properties were scrutinized under a microscope. I reveled in the chaos I had helped create. My revenge was not just about hurting him, it was about reclaiming my power and making sure he understood the cost of his betrayal. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to wonder if I was losing myself in this quest for revenge. The thrill was addictive, but it was also isolating. I found myself distancing from friends and family, consumed by my desire to see Mark suffer. I had become obsessed with the idea of justice, but at what cost? As I continued to execute my plan, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was becoming the very monster I sought to destroy. The lines between right and wrong blurred, and I was left questioning whether this path would truly bring me peace. The aftermath of my revenge began to unfold in ways I hadn't anticipated. Mark's properties were in turmoil. The media coverage had sparked a firestorm of criticism, and his reputation had taken a nosedive. Investors who once flocked to him were now hesitant to engage. The once charismatic real estate mogul was now a pariah in the community, and I couldn't help but feel a twisted sense of satisfaction at the sight of his downfall. But with each passing day, the weight of my actions began to settle heavily on my conscience. I had started this journey seeking justice for my own pain, but now I found myself grappling with the consequences of my choices. I had not only attacked Mark but had also inadvertently hurt others, his employees, his family, and even my wife, who was left in the fallout of our shattered lives. I watched as Mark's once thriving business crumbled. He was forced to lay off employees, and the news of his financial struggles spread like wildfire. The whispers in the community grew louder, and I could see the toll it was taking on him. He had been a proud man, and now he was reduced to a shell of his former self. I felt a pang of guilt as I saw him at a local cafe, his shoulders slumped, his eyes filled with defeat. I had wanted him to suffer, but seeing him like this made me question if I had gone too far. My wife, too, was affected by the chaos. She had initially been oblivious to my plans, but as the news broke, she began to piece together the puzzle. I could see the concern etched on her face whenever we were together. "What's happening with Mark? I've heard things, bad things," she asked one evening, her voice tinged with worry. I could feel the tension rise in my chest as I struggled to maintain my facade. "Just some business troubles," I replied, trying to sound casual, but the tension in the air was palpable. I could sense that she was beginning to suspect that I was involved in more than just passive observation. The guilt gnawed at me, and I could see the cracks forming in our already fragile relationship. As Mark's situation worsened, I found myself grappling with a moral dilemma. Had I crossed a line? I had set out to reclaim my power, to make him pay for his betrayal, but now it felt like I was watching a man drown. I wrestled with the realization that my quest for revenge had not only hurt him but had also affected countless others, including myself. I began to question my motivations. Was this really about justice, or had it become something more sinister? I spent sleepless nights wrestling with my thoughts, my mind racing with images of Mark's downfall and the damage I had inflicted. I had once believed that revenge would bring me closure, but now it felt like an endless cycle of pain. One evening, I received a call from an unknown number. It was the journalist I had initially contacted. "I just wanted to give you a heads up," he said, his tone serious. "Mark been in touch with his lawyers. He's considering taking legal action against some of the claims made in the articles. He's not going down without a fight." My heart sank. I hadn't anticipated this response. The idea of a legal battle filled me with dread. I had thought that exposing Mark would be the end of it, that I could walk away from this mess, but now it felt like I was entangled in a web of consequences I couldn't escape. I sat in silence, processing the implications of his words. Mark was fighting back, and I could no longer hide behind the anonymity of my actions. The thought of being exposed terrified me. I had worked hard to keep my involvement secret, and now it felt like I was standing on the edge of a precipice, ready to fall. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my revenge had become a double-edged sword. I had sought to bring Mark down, but now I was at risk of losing everything I had worked for as well. The pain of betrayal had morphed into a fear of retribution, and I felt trapped in my own game. Days turned into a blur as I tried to navigate the fallout. I noticed the distance growing between my wife and me. She had become more withdrawn, and I could sense her frustration. "You're not the same," she said one night, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've changed, and I don't know how to reach you anymore." Her words hit me like a ton of bricks. I had become so consumed by my desire for revenge that I had neglected the very person I was trying to protect. The realization struck me hard. In my quest to punish Mark, I had lost sight of what truly mattered. My marriage, my happiness, and my own sense of self were slipping away. The guilt weighed heavily on my heart, and I knew I had to make a choice. I could continue down this path, letting revenge consume me, or I could find a way to make amends, to take responsibility for my actions. I had to confront Mark, not as an enemy, but as a man who had once been my friend. The thought of facing him terrified me. I had wanted to see him suffer, but now I realized that perhaps the only way to heal was to seek a resolution, not through vengeance, but through understanding. I had to find a way to bridge the chasm that had formed between us, even if it meant confronting my own demons. As I sat alone in my living room, I made a decision. I would reach out to Mark, to offer him a chance to talk. I wanted to understand the man behind the betrayal, to see if there was a way to find closure for both of us. It was a daunting task, but I knew it was the only way to reclaim my life and put an end to the cycle of revenge. The decision to reach out to Mark weighed heavily on me. I knew that confronting him could reopen wounds that I had hoped would heal with time. Yet I also understood that continuing down the path of revenge was only dragging me deeper into a pit of anger and regret. I drafted an email, carefully choosing my words. I wanted to express my desire to talk, to clear the air, and perhaps find a way to understand his actions. After hitting send, I felt a mix of anxiety and relief. Days passed, and I anxiously awaited a response. The silence was deafening, and I began to doubt whether I had made the right choice. But then, just as I was about to give up hope, my phone buzzed with a notification. It was Mark. His response was short but direct. "Let's meet. I'll be at our usual spot." When the day arrived, I felt a knot of apprehension in my stomach. The cafe where we had shared countless laughs and celebrated each other's successes now felt like a battleground. As I entered, I scanned the room for Mark. He was already seated at a corner table, looking older and more worn than I remembered. I took a deep breath and walked over, my heart pounding. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Thanks for agreeing to meet." Mark looked up, his eyes reflecting a mixture of surprise and unease. "Yeah, well, things have been tough," he replied, his voice hesitant. We exchanged awkward pleasantries, both aware of the elephant in the room. "I've seen the news," I started, trying to find the right words. "I know things have gotten out of hand." He nodded, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized as a sign of stress. "You don't know the half of it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't think it would come to this. A part of me wanted to unleash the fury I had bottled up, to remind him of the betrayal and the pain he had caused. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw a man who was struggling, a man who was paying the price for his choices. I realized that this conversation was not just about him, it was about me too. "Why did you do it?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Why my wife?" Mark sighed deeply, the weight of his remorse evident in his posture. "I don't have a good answer for you," he admitted. "I was caught up in my own world, my own desires. I didn't think about the consequences. I made a terrible mistake." His admission struck me hard. It was the first time I had heard him acknowledge the gravity of his actions. "You hurt me, Mark. You hurt my family," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "I lost everything because of you." "I know," he replied, his eyes filled with regret. "I wish I could take it back. I never meant for it to go this far. I was selfish, and I've been paying for it ever since." I could see the pain etched on his face, and for the first time I felt a flicker of empathy. I had spent so much time focusing on my own suffering that I had neglected to consider his. We were both victims of our choices, trapped in a cycle of betrayal and regret. "I don't want this to be the end of our friendship," I said, surprising myself with the words. "But I need to know that you understand the impact of what you did." Mark nodded, his expression somber. "I do, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make amends. I can't undo the past, but I can try to be a better person moving forward." As we talked, the tension that had hung between us began to dissipate. We shared stories, memories of our friendship that had once brought us joy. It was a painful but necessary conversation, one that forced us both to confront our actions and the consequences they had wrought. By the end of our meeting, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't anticipated. I realized that holding onto my anger and resentment had only weighed me down. In seeking revenge, I had lost sight of the importance of forgiveness, both for Mark and for myself. As I left the cafe, I felt lighter. The burden of my revenge had begun to lift, replaced by a newfound understanding. I had taken back my power not through destruction, but through reconciliation. When I returned home, my wife was waiting for me, concern etched on her face. "How did it go?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It was hard," I admitted, "but it was necessary. I think we can move forward now, both of us." I could see the relief wash over her, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope for our future. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding not only my relationship with my wife, but also my own sense of self. I took a step back from the anger that had consumed me, choosing instead to embrace the healing process. Mark still faced the consequences of his actions, but I was no longer the architect of his downfall. The journey toward forgiveness was not easy, but it was a path I was willing to walk. I had learned that revenge may offer a temporary thrill, but it is understanding and compassion that pave the way for true healing. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of peace settling over me. I had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. I was ready to embrace the next chapter of my life, free from the chains of betrayal and revenge. In that moment, I understood that life is not about the wrongs we endure, but how we choose to rise above them, and with that realization I took a deep breath, ready to move forward.